Welcome to the Lap Podcast. This is episode 10, The Outside Overtake. In this episode, we're recapping the controversial end of the United States Grand Prix, the prospects of the final 5 races on the calendar, our thoughts heading into the Mexican Grand Prix, and more. Well, let's just get this thing started. This is going to be a little bit of a different style of podcast than you're used to. Got some life stuff, I'll tell you about at the end here. It's Tristan Rines getting us started here on the Lap Podcast, post United States Grand Prix. An exciting race, a controversial race, a race that had a number of implications surrounding it, and the opportunities surrounding this race were massive. But we got a very mixed result. But I do want to at least highlight our winners to start this off. Obviously, we got to start with the absolutely dominant weekend that Ferrari had. Across both the sprint and race formats, the Ferraris absolutely exceeded expectations when it came time for actual racing. And this was a weekend that I think, if I'm recalling correctly, on our last podcast, Kevin and I were kind of, writing off a little bit. Not to say that Ferrari were, out of the mix here, but they weren't coming to mind as a team that was anticipated to win a Grand Prix, right? Talking about McLaren, Mercedes potentially as a spoiler, where Red Bull factored into this. We talked about Ferrari the least. In fact, we talked about Ferrari in the context of next season. Ferrari brought 0 upgrades to this Grand Prix, and we're still able to eke out a strong, dominant weekend when it came to the actual racing aspect. I mean, behind a bit on one lap pace for qualifying, the setup windows were absolutely on it throughout the weekend. In the sprint, Carlos Sainz landing in a strong second place behind Max Verstappen by less than 4 seconds in a 19-lap shootout while nursing the medium tire, which seemed to be the tire of choice for the entire weekend, but Ferrari were just that much better on him. Sainz was impressive in overtaking Leclerc Saturday, starting from P5, again up to that second place finish. Over the whole weekend, honestly, Carlos Sainz was taking no prisoners. And then when it came time for the feature race, Charles made the most of Verstappen and Norris battling it into turn 1. It was an opportunistic moment for Charles Leclerc, thinking back to how Monza went. Starting from P4, turning that into a race win, a little bit of parity, if you will, on these last 2 wins for the Scuderia. And with Carlos not far behind to take advantage of those opportunities bestowed upon them again by that Norris and that Max battle, it was a really nice window of opportunity to take the lead for Charles and then just never look back. Leclerc, by the end of it, collecting his 8th win of his career, the 3rd win of this season alone, alongside the aforementioned Monza, as well as the, story-defining win at Monaco. Unfortunate, though, and there is a little bit of an unfortunate side to this past weekend, Leclerc's shot at winning the championship, the Drivers' Championship after this weekend, it still feels pretty far away, if I'm going to be completely honest. It would take Charles about, I think the average is like 16 points per weekend over the last 5 weekends to beat Max by the end of Abu Dhabi. Now, I know we have a couple of sprints thrown in there as well, so that's just an average of over the weekend, but it just feels a little bit unrealistic. A strong weekend nonetheless, and an unforgettable year for the Monegasque, but there is a tinge, the unfortunate lining around this race is that at least one of these drivers, and it seems to be, and as I'm going to get to, both of the championship contenders behind Max, not quite in that picture. But I wanted to make a second little aside comment considering our winners here. The trophies were kind of weird, and I don't know if anybody else really caught this. Apparently there were some issues with copyrights. I was reading Autosport, their website, and it said something about them having some copyright issues with the intended trophies. They kind of looked almost like Mickey Mouse Lego guys or something of that nature. And then when push came to shove at the end of the race, it felt weird to me that they were just handing out like the fastest lap tires. They handed the one for the constructors win to the Ferrari team member. They handed one apparently with like a silver like bolt in the center to Carlos Sainz, a bronze one in the center to Max Verstappen, and then this very like nondescript, very basic trophy was handed over to Charles. Something about that just felt kind of weird to me. And I hope it felt weird to you guys too, admittedly, but there are obviously a few more things we need to be talking about throughout this weekend. And of course, Max and Lando, not just an incident, a controversy for Lando Norris as he battled with Max Verstappen for that final podium place in the race. I think it was lap 53. They both went wide, coming out of, I think it was turn 12, if I'm not mistaken, 12 or 13. Wide, and then both of them, all four tires leaving track, and Norris overtaking Verstappen off track in the eyes of the FIA stewards. Other incidents like this happened over the course of the weekend, both sprint and the race, even with Toto Wolff and George Russell having some comments about the incident to each other over the radio and semi into the media as well. Norris was given a 5-second penalty as a result of the overtake, elevated Verstappen back onto the podium as we saw, and net the Dutchman 2 more points in his championship rivalry. And look, in my opinion, this should have just been labeled a racing incident, to be completely honest with you. I thought it was really awkward that the FIA decided to scrutinize this incident as a very one-sided moment for Norris over Verstappen when both drivers were off track. They were both battling for position. If anything, it felt like Max was a little bit more obliged to leave space there for his opponent. We talk about these kind of things a lot when it comes to the context of these kinds of overtakes, but Max went excessively wide. Again, you don't go wide with all four wheels off track without a little bit of intentionality there, in my opinion. So, forcing Norris wide, obviously Lando had nowhere to go as they're racing wheel to wheel. And now it puts Lando in a position where for him to even sniff a chance at the championship, he's going to have to beat Max out by 11 points a weekend over this final stretch to win the title. Similar to Leclerc, who's a little bit further back, a little less attainable. And unfortunately, it just feels a little too far-fetched with Red Bull seemingly at least having pulled this car just enough together just to remain competitive, to be fighting for at least that final spot on the podium. And their Red Bull, to their credit, are matching their rivals depending on the weekend. So the car is at least hitting a good window if you're Red Bull. And overall, this just felt like a massive missed chance for McLaren. I talked a lot during the last episode. Kevin and I both talked a lot about what this weekend really meant to the title chase, to the opportunity for McLaren. And it felt like a huge opportunity for the Papaya team to really break the Drivers' Championship open. Instead, they finished behind Verstappen in both the sprint and the race. And even if the penalty doesn't happen, Norris doesn't gain nearly enough points in P3 with Max in P4 regardless. So while Ferrari took the day, McLaren seemed to have lost their own war, so to speak. Lando's botched from pole once again, as Verstappen was primed to take him onto turn 1 once again, is another in a long series, in my eyes, of missed opportunity after missed opportunity after missed opportunity for McLaren this year. And it's really a shame, because Piastri did what he could, finishing behind Lando Norris, and I'm going to be interested to see where this dynamic goes going into 2025 and then onwards. I mean, they're an incredibly talented and an incredibly exciting driver pairing. But my argument is, when the slate is at 0, I think that there's a good chance that Piastri, with his racecraft, if he's battling Norris as far as qualifying positions off jump, I mean, Piastri could really throw a nice wrinkle into the team dynamics here. But circling back here, it's just another missed chance for McLaren, who at the very least still have a firm grip on the Constructors' Championship. But when you break it all down and condense it, and you look over the course of this entire season, it's just missed opportunity after missed opportunity after missed opportunity for McLaren. And it's frustrating because we want to see these championship battles develop. We saw there being hope. We saw there being a real opportunity. And for it to fall this short, right? For this window to be ever that much more closed. A double-digit point difference over the last 5 races. I don't see Red Bull being so incompetent to allow either of their opponents to cobble together enough points to really make this possible. But I think McLaren really do take some ownership over that, not taking that opportunity, not taking those chances, and not being intentional when it comes to the strategy, when it comes to who the lead driver is going to be, when it comes to who is going to be achieving these race wins, and execution-wise from the drivers at times, right? Not taking those opportunities and not seizing the gravity of the moment. And maybe, just maybe, Lando isn't championship material. That raw championship pedigree, that intensity that somebody like a Max Verstappen has, like a Lewis Hamilton has shown, like a Fernando Alonso, like the Schumachers of the past, right? Going further and further back. These guys saw opportunities and took them. They were fearless. They were aggressive. And the way that Lando has kind of walked through this window within this championship, within the possibility of etching his name into Formula One immortality, a huge year nonetheless, got some race wins under his belt. But I think at the moment, maybe just at the moment, the lights are maybe still a little bit too bright, because we've seen what Lando looks like when he's dominant. But then you have weekends like this where, again, it's just opportunities kind of slipping out of fingers. You would want more from somebody this talented. I think maybe there's still a bit of an experience factor that comes together when it comes to Lando. However, at the end of it all, I think there was just a nutshell moment of disappointment when it comes to Lando. But moving on, though, Mercedes, man, a disappointing weekend, to be completely honest with you. After believing Mercedes were going to really make this an interesting weekend at the front, like they were going to be able to compete at the front with the likes of McLaren, would maybe play the spoiler for Red Bull and really open up this championship, right? Even Mercedes didn't quite do their part to keep this all as captivating for our Formula One audience, right? A decent result in the sprint, finishing P5, P6, there's not a lot of points to really be that are going to move a lot of the needle, at least for a Mercedes anyway. But a really poor qualifying for Lewis had him start from P17 for the race, and the George Russell crash in qualifying session 3 meant he was going to start from the pit lane. So 3 laps into the feature race, of course, Lewis beaching the car at the same corner that Russell had his crash in Q3. Russell, though, to his credit, managed to claw his way back all the way to P6 from the garage. So, a little small golf clap for George Russell, but overall, it was a really messy weekend and a huge disappointment for Lewis Hamilton. Even with the same car even with the car having some issues, it was just really shocking to see him have such a challenging time. And to be fair, during the feature race, he was navigating his way up the field. I believe he was in P12 when he actually had the incident. So it's not like Lewis wasn't moving up, and it's not like the car didn't have good pace when it came time to actually perform, but something catching him out. There were obviously a lot of reports of wind over the course of the weekend, especially during that first day of free practice, that were catching a lot of people out, even during the feature race and the sprint, going up the main hill of Coda. I think Yuki Tsunoda, Zhou Guan Yu, Valtteri Bottas, a lot of people were having issues with wind and the elevation changes, but obviously there was a bit of an issue with the car and a very rare Lewis Hamilton DNF. I think maybe only his second of the season, if I'm not mistaken, the other one going back to Australia. But overall, it was a very messy weekend for Mercedes and pretty much one to forget. But one team that was able to capitalize as much as possible over the course of this weekend at their home race, Haas had a very eventful lead up to the United States Grand Prix. And then as they landed in Austin, the Toyota partnership being announced, grabbing some other sponsors to help make this car and make the organization even better. A double points finish in the sprint race with P8 and P7 for K-Mag and Nico Hülkenberg, netting 3 points there. Then in the feature race, Nico Hülkenberg still landing in P8, totaling out 7 for the entire weekend, and advancing over V-Carb in the constructors. We talked about the consequences of higher placement on this podcast a few times. That is millions of more dollars that go into the infrastructure. That is millions of more potential dollars of prize money at the end of the year if Haas continue this kind of trajectory. I mean, and look, their team principal Komatsu doing amazing things, a lot of great work to take this car that, in my personal opinion, I didn't expect to sniff past P9 this year in the constructors, putting them in a position, I believe it's P6. I mean, masterful job. The development trajectory has been really good for this team, has been really solid. They've consistently brought upgrades. They're not doing just, chunky, throw it all at the wall upgrade packages all at once. This was a huge weekend for the American-based team at their home race. I mean, I gave a golf clap to George Russell, but this is a proper clap it up for the Haas team. This was a massive weekend. They deserve their flowers. Again, especially with the expectations being where they were at the beginning of this year. I mean, chef's kiss. This was an awesome weekend for Haas. And speaking of awesome weekends, V-Carb, even though they dropped in the constructors, there was still a bit of a silver lining here. They didn't walk out of the weekend with no points. Liam Lawson, hey, I'm gonna pat myself on the back. He kicked ass, man. He really did. Got into a proper scrap with Fernando Alonso during the sprint. I went back and watched those onboards. Somebody posted it on Twitter, if I'm not mistaken. But I was watching the onboard, and I can understand why Fernando Alonso was frustrated. Do not get me wrong. But it was aggressive. It was scrappy. It was ambitious from the youngster in his second debut weekend in Formula One after last year, being dropped into the car into the Netherlands and surviving through all that crazy weather. Liam Lawson, man, he's making the most of his shot. And there's obviously going to be a lot of conversation as to what happens with the Red Bull seat, the second seat there, with Checo Perez being what looks to be the former shell of himself at the moment. I think he landed P7 this weekend. Whew. Liam Lawson, a super strong weekend, proved me right. I said going into this weekend he was going to be the guy with the drive of the day. I think he was incredibly strong when it came to the race pace. Kid's a baller. In my opinion, what else needs to be said? As we start to wrap this up, at least my time here. Outside of that, no real headlines from Austin. Heading into the Mexican Grand Prix this coming weekend, I do want to drop you guys my predictions on the podium. I think it's going to be a very interesting podium. In fact, I would dare say it's going to be an ambitious podium. I think we're going to see Max Verstappen back on the top step this weekend. He's in another league in the sense of where he's taking this Red Bull car, even with the mess that they're dealing with. I'm going to call it. I think Max Verstappen blows the championship out of the water. I think this is the weekend for Max. After getting a sprint win in Austin, I'm feeling it, man. I think Max, I'm not saying he's back, because it's not like the guy ever left, but back on the top step, I could very well see that in Mexico. At number 2, pulling into the silver spot, give me Charles Leclerc to finish P2, adding to a very strong year. Not quite the top step, but Charles is that good. And then 3, it's going to be one of the McLarens. It's going to be Oscar Piastri. This is another weekend where we start to have a lot of those conversations coming out of it going, who really is going to be the face of this team? There's going to be a lot of storyline coming out of this. Now, obviously, it's just a prediction, but if that were to happen, I mean, the conversations throughout the offseason, man, the back and forth, I can already see it. I can already smell the headlines right now. I can see it coming. The DNF, call it a sequel, an unfortunate sequel, depending on where you stand in the Formula One fan base, but I got Sergio Perez as my DNF. First DNF, regardless. Sergio Perez, his home race, All the man wants to do is win there, and I think he's kind of past that window of opportunity as far as the the capability. Last year would have been the best shot. DNF in a turn 1. Goodness. And the drive of the day, I think it's going to be another strong weekend for Franco Colapinto. Williams have done pretty well with these long straights. There's obviously a lot of very high-speed movement in Mexico. A super massive straight before turn 1. The long S's moving through the second half of the circuit. Man, I think Franco Colapinto's got what it takes this weekend. I really do. But with all that being said, I'm going to start to turn this one over to our friend Kevin Walker. I should be back next week, per normal. Had to do this one differently. Personal life news. I want to announce I am getting married. So, we'll do what we have to do to necessitate, but I wanted to make sure that we could still bring you the quality podcast that you tune into every single week for us. So please, please, but I just want to say thank you guys so much for listening. I'm going to hand this one off to Kevin. So, Kevin, Mr. Kevin Walker, please round us out.
Thank you, Tristan, and congrats on the big news and good stuff from you as always. But I'll take it from here, folks. As always, I'm Kevin Walker, your McLaren aficionado, unofficially, of course, and I'll add on to some of what Tristan pointed out and some of my own takeaways from this exhilarating Austin Grand Prix over the weekend, as well as my own predictions for the Mexican Grand Prix this weekend. Let's start with the Lando Norris talk. As always, my take for Lando Norris is a little biased, but I do want to include that Tristan himself even said it was a race incident. He really should not have been penalized for it. That penalty ended up being big, and it ended up being what could be the end of McLaren's and Lando Norris's driver championship hopes this year. It really stinks. If you look at it from multiple angles, you can kind of see Max is taking a very hard, straight way into that turn, which is pushing off Lando Norris, making him have to overtake on the outside. I know there was a lot of discussion as well in the McLaren pit wall as to maybe Lando should have just gave up the spot and fought from behind anyway. As much as I do like that idea, it kind of sounded like the FIA was already determined that they were going to give Lando a 5-second time penalty, which at that point, your best bet is to do what McLaren tried to do, which was build up that 5-second gap, which of course they only were able to get to 4 seconds, I want to say just over 4 seconds ahead of Max. It just wasn't enough to prove the difference. So Lando goes home behind Max. Max extends his lead in the driver championship, and McLaren continues to fight from behind. Now, something that Tristan brought up, which I thought was very interesting, was essentially, is Lando Norris the guy? Is he going to be the guy that can bring home these championship points and eventually a driver's championship? McLaren kind of have, dare I say, the constructors under their wraps. They've kind of already got it done and taken care of. They're 40 points above Red Bull, and the way that Lando and Oscar are driving, whether if they're not landing P1s, P2s or not, they're still bringing home massive points to extend their lead, especially with Checo bleeding points and Max fighting and getting 125% out of that car. It just kind of looks like McLaren's going to walk home with the constructors. So the battle really is, can Lando bring home the championship? Well, I think it's a really good conversation because, like Tristan pointed out, he has, and McLaren has, this kind of falls on both sides, missed out on so many opportunities, so many chances to capitalize, bring home points, and make this a real fight, which he kind of already has. But here in the past couple of weeks, it kind of felt, past couple of races, I should say, it's kind of felt as though Lando has not been firing on all cylinders. It's kind of, earlier on this year, it was kind of like, oh, well, he can win, but can he win from pole? And it's kind of interesting that we talk about that because I saw a fact out there, and this is a little mind-blowing. Charles, who we'll talk about a little bit more, had an excellent weekend as well with Ferrari. Charles has as many wins from Lando Norris's pole So when Lando lands P1 in qualifying and he gets pole going into race day, Charles has as many wins from Lando's pole as Lando has from his own pole, which is one. They each have one apiece, which isn't all that, big of a stat, but they both have 3 wins this year. And it kind of feels like as of late, Charles has really turned it on. But, ending off with the McLaren talk, I think Lando can be the guy, but I don't want to say that he's got to do it now, but it kind of feels like he does. Oscar's right there on his footsteps trying to make those moves. It's obvious that Oscar is trying to play teammate hero, and I appreciate that from a McLaren standpoint, trying to do everything you can and sit behind Lando, even though you obviously feel like you're the better driver. Every driver feels like they're the better driver with their partner, but it kind of feels like this year, I don't want to say it's the only year, because I feel like if Lando doesn't get, looking into 25, if Lando doesn't get off into a hot start in 25, we might be talking winning 3 out of 5 races to start it off. Then McLaren might shift their hopes and be like, all right, well, look, we got to see what Oscar can do and make this a real fight. No more, hey, Oscar, take the back seat. We're going to try to do what we can for Lando. It's going to be Lando, look, we tried. But we got to see what Oscar can do, because if you can't win a championship, we need to see if Oscar can. And I think with that's going to be a really tough pill for a lot of McLaren fans to swallow. Obviously, I will say for the papaya, we love Lando. He's great. We think he's ultra competitive. We think he is a championship level driver. But you got to wonder with these mess ups. Now, here's something to think about. Staying a little bit more on the pessimistic side. On the optimistic side, sorry. I think Lando took a lot of learning this year. Let's just say, for lack of conversation, let's just say Max does take home the Drivers' Championship. McLaren takes home the Constructors, a really good year from them. Let's not forget, McLaren fans, that Lando came into this year with not a single win in his career. Let's not forget, Lando no wins was a real thing. He's got 3 this year, and I'm not saying that that's buttloads of wins, right? It's not like a Max domination, but we came in like asking Lando for a win. And one way or another, he gave us 3. 2 of them very dominant wins. And I think with that, there's been learning. He has learned a lot this year. And that's something you got to take away. It's something he can take with him going into next year. If they don't win the Drivers' Championship specifically this year, that's something he can take going into next year. Where it's like, look, I've learned how to compete. I've learned how to battle at the top, how to manage my tires certain ways. You learn all those intricacies as you battle. I think that's something he'll be able to take going into next year, say Max does win. Speaking of Max, I think it's kind of fair to say, despite what Tristan said, he is kind of back. He is kind of back-ish, if you will. He never really left. He was always kind of competing, but it kind of felt like, and I know me and Tristan definitely agreed on this, that Max was going to be battling from like P5, P6 areas. But like I said, he just keeps getting every ounce out of that car and keeps putting it on podium. And I just don't know how he does it. We know how he does it. He's an incredible driver and a pretty good car, a relatively good car. Checo does not prove the performance of that car, but Max gets every ounce out of it. I think it's a P4, P5 car on track, but Max just gets everything he can out of it, puts it on the podium every time he gets the chance to do it. So I would say he is back-ish. Another good weekend for Max to extend his championship lead, of course. That lead now sitting at 57 between him and Lando. But let's move on to Charles. It was a really, really good weekend for Ferrari. I agree 100% with Tristan that we kind of wrote off Ferrari. We said, hey, they might be a guy, or they might be a team that could play a little spoiler, if you will. But they're definitely competing, and they're definitely showing up. And Charles has had a stellar year, an absolute stellar year. And it kind of feels like Ferrari might have something figured out. Now, I do want to pump the brakes. Charles is 79 points behind in the Drivers' Championship. Just like how we're kind of saying that Max might have this thing wrapped up with Lando being 57, the likeliness of Charles somehow pulling off the Drivers' Championship from P3 right now in the standings is highly, highly, highly unlikely. And I don't think that's nothing against him. Ferrari have worked all year to figure out this car. And Austin was a track that worked to their advantage big time. And they took advantage of it, bringing home a P1, P2 finish, really good race from Carlos Sainz. And like I said, a stellar race from Charles. A really good weekend for Ferrari overall. Now, let's stay with Ferrari a little bit. Because I know we did talk about them in 25, and I think that's going to be something that is worth discussing. I mean, yes, you can look at right now and you can look at this year, but I think that is something worth discussing. But it looks like, as of right now, Ferrari, they have 446 points in the constructors. They're just under 100 points behind McLaren, who lead. But it's going to be interesting to see how strong they are this or next year. Charles has put together a really strong year, and next year, obviously, unless you've been sleeping under a rock, Lewis is going to be with him. That's going to be a really, really, really good driver lineup, and they're going to be able to do some really nice things. And if Ferrari can continue on the pace that they're at right now and keep battling, they're going to be a really good title contender next year. Now, I know I got to keep this thing short, so I'm going to try to do my best. Let's move over to some more rookie news, if you will. Ollie Behrman and Kimi Antonelli will be racing in FP1 this weekend. That should be super exciting. I know that Tristan wasn't able to record before this news came out, so Kimi is going to be the guy. He's going to take over Lewis's spot for the FP1 this weekend. Ollie as well. As many know, Ollie and Kimi, they're very good friends. Moving over, let's talk about Lawson a little bit. I know Tristan already kind of talked about it, but I wanted to throw my own spin on things. I think Lawson had a fantastic weekend, finishing P9, getting points in that car is, I would say, a little surprising, but we kind of predicted it. It was a good weekend from Lawson. He really showed, and I think the spin I'm going to take, I think it put a little bit of heat under, a little more heat, I should say, under Checo's seat. We already know that Checo's in a really bad spot, whether if that be mentally or just, whatever has gone on with him this year. He's just not that same driver. He's bled a lot of points for Red Bull. He's the reason why we're having these talks about Red Bull not able to keep what was the constructors, and now they're struggling to keep the drivers because Checo can't fend off anybody. So I think Lawson's drive turned the burners on just a little bit more underneath Checo's seat. And I think if Lawson keeps doing this, if he keeps continuing to race at a high pace, high level, and keep competing with these veterans on the track like he did with Alonso, I think we might see some discussion about Lawson possibly taking over that Red Bull seat. Maybe if not next year, in the coming future. Who knows? We'll see how things shake out. Now, let's shift over to my personal Mexican Grand Prix predictions. I know that Tristan had, I believe he said Max was going to take it over, taking the top podium, Charles behind him, and then Oscar MP3. And I think him justifying that was essentially McLaren just saying, look, we don't really have a good chance at the Drivers' Championship. We're just going to let y'all race. And thinking that Oscar is going to pass him, which is very well a good possibility. I think that is certainly a possibility that could happen. But my personal prediction is I think this track suits McLaren very well. Austin did not. We kind of walked into Austin knowing that, but thought with McLaren's dominance that maybe they were going to overcome those obstacles and try to figure it out either way. Ferrari was so confident they didn't even bring upgrades. So I think this weekend in Mexico will fare very well for the McLaren, for the Papaya. I think Lando takes the top back. I think he's going to finish P1, finish with the race win, and I think he's going to do it in a dominant fashion. I think he's going to come back in a well-suited track. I think he's going to deliver a 10-second plus victory. I think it's going to be a good weekend for Lando, and he's going to be able to keep that race going between him and Max, but not if Verstappen doesn't have something to say about it, because I think he's going to finish P2. I think he's just going to keep continuing to get every ounce out of that car that he can, And I think that this is a track that Max is very successful at. I mean, we all know this. He's won multiple times. He's got the most wins at the Mexico Grand Prix. So I think Max is going to be able to finish P2 to keep that driver championship race alive. But I do see Lando edging it out. And then P3, I got Oscar finishing P3. I think Oscar's going to have a really good race as well, like he's been doing. I think he's going to get passed by Verstappen at the last second. I think McLaren's going to have that 1-2 for I would say majority of the race. I'm going to go a little bit specifics here. I think they're going to have majority of that race at a 1-2 for the McLarens, but I think that he's going to get passed. He being Oscar is going to get passed by Max in the last second, therefore making your Lando, Max, Oscar P1, P2, P3 finish. For my DNF, I have Zhou Guanyu. I think he's struggling with that car. It's just not functioning how he wants to. He had a spin out last week, and I just kind of see him not doing very well at this track. And my driver of the day, give some golf claps, if you will, for Tristan. I think it's going to be George Russell. I think he had a stellar weekend in Austin. I feel like his drive kind of went unnoticed other than the Mercedes fans. You know, starting at a really rough spot and finishing where he did, bringing home the points despite Lewis not able to finish that race, getting beached out in the gravel. I think George is going to have a really good weekend in Mexico. I would maybe say he probably finishes like a P4, P5 finish. I think George, obviously he's going to be the future for Mercedes. I think he's going to have a stellar weekend, and that's how I think this weekend is going to finish up. As always, thank you all for listening. I know it's a little wonky having Tristan go before me, but hopefully you still tuned in, you still liked it. As always, make sure you're listening to us, The Lapped Podcast, Spotify, and YouTube on Tristan's YouTube page, Tristan Blake Rines. I don't know if we get that enough of a shout out. As always, thank you for tuning in. My name is Kevin Walker. I'm signing off for now until next week. Hopefully we'll have Tristan back. We'll come back with our thoughts and opinions on the Mexico Grand Prix. Until next time, you've been listening to The Lap Podcast.